All right, for our next lecture here, we're rocking and rolling. We've talked about all the different explorers, all the different countries that have gone out and kind of mapped for the Europeans. Again, all these other people who are living here already know all about this stuff. Have mapped all this stuff for the Europeans. So now we're going to get into how are the Europeans going to set up to run these colonial empires that they're going creating and what effect these colonial empires have not only on the colonists settling in these places, on the Europeans back in Europe, and then all the other people that they're exploiting to be able to run these as cheaply as possible to maximize profits for the Europeans. And then we'll get into a little bit today, but mostly in the final presentation for this unit on some of the effects that start to happen from this age of exploration on the environment and on humanity as a whole. So, like I said, we're going to hit all the big major players here. The key caveat we want to do this because again, we're in the United States, so we want to understand how we get to the modern day United States. When we're talking about colonies, this is going to be colonies in the New World is where we're going to focus here. Okay, so these are colonies in the New World. We'll get to some of the colonies in the rest part of the world in future units. But again, this is the key part right here. We're just focusing, when we say colonies, we're focusing on colonies in the sense of, let me draw an arrow, in the New World. So just again, so what we're saying here might not have affect what's going on, say, for Spanish colonies in the Philippines, which are also run by Spain, but we're looking at colonies just in the New World. So important caveat. Number one, Spain is going to have colonies that stretch from San Francisco in modern day Northern California all the way down through New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Mexico, Latin America, and then Western South America, all the way down to the southern tip of Argentina and Tierra del Fuego. This is a massive amount of territory that is, quote, under control of the Spanish, end quote. In these New World colonies, mostly men from Spain are going to the New World colonies. Now, we've talked about the reasons and causes for it, particularly in Spain. They're trying to seek their fortune and make money, and if they strike it rich, they can make a ton of money. But again, men being men, there's not a whole lot of Spanish women that are coming over to these New World colonies. So the Spanish men begin to have relationships, I'll put quotation marks, however you want to phrase this, with the native women that are in these areas. These relationships are going to create a large mestizo population in these Spanish New World colonies. And mestizo is a person of a mixed Spanish and Native American ancestry. And eventually what happened in a lot of these New World colonies, the colony of Mexico is the best example of this, is where the Spanish are going to develop a racial hierarchy in these colonies based on the amount of Spanish versus native ancestry you have kind of in your family tree. So child who has a Spanish from Spain mom and a Spanish from Spain dad is going to be held in, quote, held in higher regard socially, economically, politically than, say, someone who's got a native mom and a Spanish dad or a Spanish dad. And there's a whole big complex way of going and looking at it. And we'll show you an example of just how complex this can go and get here. Now, in these Spanish colonies, the Spanish are going to force the Native Americans to work in what they will call the encomienda labor system. And the encomienda labor system is where natives, again, not the Spanish, the natives are being, and again, the key word here is forced. The natives are forced to farm, ranch, and mine for their Spanish landlords. And I should not have to tell you that there is obviously lots of abuse that takes place on these native workers by these Spanish landlords and Spanish colonial masters. So again, the key word being forced, the natives are being forced at gunpoint of the threat of death and all other sorts of threats to farm, ranch, and mine for the Spanish. And again, lots of abuse in there. Portugal is going to set up again its New World colony in Brazil. And again, I would make sure I leave a lot of space under Brazil because we don't need to write a lot about this. We'll circle back to Brazil later in this PowerPoint. When the Portuguese show up in Brazil, they find there's little gold or silver. Again, there's gold in the Amazon if you see any Goofball History Channel shows, but it's not as easy, quote, to get to than, say, some of the other stuff. So because of the little amounts of gold or silver the Portuguese are able to find in Brazil, that forces them to look for wealth in other ways. And so what they begin to do is they begin to create plantations for the crop of sugar. So that requires them to clear out huge chunks of the Amazon rainforest to create giant chunks of open land to plant sugarcane to be able to harvest that and send that back to Europe. So that's how they're going to make their money initially here in Brazil with sugar plantations. The French, as we've talked about, established the colony in the New World called New France. This is going to be much of eastern Canada and most of the modern Midwestern United States. Now, the major thing that we want to understand here is that the colony of New France is going to be giant in terms of square miles and area covered. So the French North American Empire is immense, but it's going to be very sparsely populated by French settlers. So this is mainly because the French are using New France for exploiting the fur trade. So you don't need a whole lot of French guys in this territory because you already have all these Native American tribes. These Native Americans in the Great Lakes region, in eastern Canada, in the northeast of the modern United States, in the Midwest, are going and with these voyageurs for the French canoes who are sailing down these major rivers in the New France. The Native Americans are harvesting the furs, deer furs, particularly beaver furs. Again, beaver is waterproof, or is about as waterproof as you can get in the 1700s. And so they're doing all the actual harvesting of the animals, and then they're trading those fur pelts for guns and gunpowder and bullets and iron and alcohol. And so that's why the French don't need a whole lot of French people in this uh, in this territory because the Native Americans are doing the actual harvesting for them. And again, the French just have to show up and pay. Finally, England is going to set up its colonies, like we want to say, in the New World on the Caribbean islands. And again, Caribbean islands is like the number one, all right, place where they're going and setting up. And then to a lesser extent, the eastern coast of the present day United States. When we're talking about the English New World colonies, we want to make sure we get, okay, because we're Americans, so we tend to think of, oh, America's great, all this great grand thing. But the slow growing colonies in what will become the United States, we can very much contrast with the giant, huge, rich profits that are being made by the English on the Caribbean islands, again, particularly in sugar production. Now, in all of these colonies, but particularly for the colonies in the present day United States and the Caribbean islands, deaths for the English are very common, particularly deaths being brought in the blood of these colonists from malaria and yellow fever being spread by mosquitoes, which is going to cause a lot of different problems. We'll get into that more in a little bit. So this is a map that I would kind of remember for if you take U.S. history, Mr. Cranmer, because we'll see this map pop up again. This is the present day United States and Canada, and as we can see, Spain is going to have settlements all the way up in the southwest. They're going to have missions ranging all the way up to San Francisco in San Francisco Bay. They're going to have the Florida Peninsula. The English colonies are going to have a very thin strip along the eastern seaboard of the United States, and if we can compare that to the giant amount of territory owned here by the French in New France. If we were to look at this map and we ask the question of, hey, Mr. Cranmer's got $100 for you to place a bet on, what would be the best bet to be able to say that which of these three countries is going to be ruling the future North American continent 200 years later in 1923 in 2023? And most betting people would say, well, obviously France is going to do that. But we have to remember that again, Spain is colonizing, is actually settling people here, but there's not a whole lot of great places to settle down over in here. This is a giant amount of territory, but that's not what the French are after, whereas the English are slowly building up the amount of colonists that they're putting down in the seaboard here. So again, the motivations for settling these different areas are going to affect the future history of this area for the Europeans. We talked about that one of the side effects of the settlement of these Spanish colonies in the New World is going to be creation of this mestizo population. This is a chart created to kind of go and show you all the different combinations and the hierarchy of these relationship results happening because of mostly men settling in these New World colonies. The colonies that are set up for the most part outside of the French and New France are going to be plantation economies in the New World. And a plantation is a self-sufficient farm that's specialized in growing one crop for profit. So those are some key words that we want to do here, right? Self-sufficient, they don't need to rely on the government, and they're growing just one crop, and the whole reason is to make profit. So you're not setting up these plantations to go and settle to put your family on to be able to live in peace and harmony away from everybody else. You are settling these up to make cash money. And you're doing that by selling just one crop. So the big crops that we have here, and again, I would hints, winks, and nudges for the quiz, know tobacco and sugar, right? It should make sense. Those are capitalized for the final exam as well. So those are the two big ones. Now, the question we like to ask is, what about these two crops make it a great crop to be able to plant and then sell? From a seller point of view, why are tobacco and sugar great crops to be able to profit from? Hopefully, as you're thinking about that, you should understand that they are both addictive, right? Tobacco has nicotine, sugar has sugar. Sugar lights up the same parts of your brain when you consume it as someone who's taking crack cocaine, right? So they're both addictive. So from a seller's point of view, they're great crops to be able to grow because people are going to keep coming back to it. Then coffee, particularly in South America, and then eventually later on, cotton is going to be a big one, particularly in the southern east of the United States. But that's not going to come until the 1790s, early 1800s. Plantations have the effect of spreading people out along the countryside, and they're going to inhibit the growth of towns. Why are they being spread out? Because they're self-sufficient. You want to make as much money as you can, so you want to have as much cropland as tobacco and sugar as you can possibly plant. So that means you're not going to want to plant right next to somebody else or lose money. So you're going to want to spread everybody out. So this is going to have a huge impact later on. If we can compare, say, the plantations of the southern United States versus the religious Puritan towns where everybody's got to keep an eye on each other to keep them from sinning that's set up in the Northeast, we can kind of see already in the settlement of the New England colonies versus the southern colonies of the United States developing in two separate ways in their very beginning. Now, the plantation owners want to be like the nobles in Europe, and some of these plantation owners are going to be making so much money that they're going to have more money than the nobles in Europe. But the nobles in Europe, who have family lineages and wealth that stretch in some cases back to the Roman Empire, they're going to look down on these people. This is new money. This is new wealth. This is not old, prestigious wealth. So that's going to cause some conflict philosophically and also politically between the colonists in the New World and the nobles back in Europe. Now, wherever you are as a European, specifically, we're going to see a high death rate as these Europeans show up in these New World colonies, particularly from mosquito-borne diseases like malaria and yellow fever, because these are new population centers. Diseases are rampant, so cholera, which basically causes you to throw up and poop, and you're going to throw up and poop yourself to death, and then as well as attacks from natives, but natives are also being kind of included in this high death rate as well. So most Europeans will describe showing up in the New World and undergoing a seasoning time. And this is when new settlers arriving in the New World would then have to survive their initial infections with these diseases from malaria and yellow fever. Some of these people who are landing in Charleston, South Carolina, already have malaria by the time they leave the boats because the mosquitoes are biting them as they are approaching them in harbor. So malaria, again, is a pretty nasty disease. Basically, it's a parasitic infection of your blood. Your body fights it off by turning the temperature up, and so you get crazy of like body temperatures of like 110, 115, where basically your brain starts to stew in its own juices. So you either survive this or you die from this malaria. But the fun part about particularly malaria is this is going to stay in your body. And so you're going to have flare-ups about every 7 years. So not a whole lot of fun. Now, importantly, the Europeans don't want to do work themselves. This is very much, I teach freshmen, so freshmen don't want to do any work themselves. And so, remember, why can't you do it for me? So the Europeans don't want to do any of this hard work for themselves, so they're going to start enslaving people to do the work for them. Now, they're going to start off with the natives, but as we'll see, as those natives begin to die off or run away, they are then going to switch and move to African slaves to do the labor for them. We'll talk about that switch to African slaves in a second. So these plantations are basically making sugar, right? Sugar comes from a variety of different ways today, but basically back then from the sugar cane plant. So these are, kind of think of a closely looking like in appearance to bamboo. So big giant canes. So you plant entire fields of them. You then need a machete and a lot of people to go out to these sugarcane fields when the plants are ready to go and chop them all up, right? These plants are then put into big, huge, giant presses where the juices of them are squeezed out. And then you go and boil those juices away, and what are you left with? The sweet sugar that's left, and this is brown sugar. If it goes through further refinement, you can get the brown sugar, taking the molasses out of the brown sugar, and you're left with just white sugar. And then you have white sugar and molasses to be able to go and sell. So we see vast, huge amounts of land on these plantations being taken over for processing of the sugar cane and other things as well. Now, while they're showing up to harvest these sugarcane plantations, people are dying from malaria. Right? Again, this is a parasite that gets into your body, that basically gets into your blood and starts killing people. Millions of people in the world today still die from malaria. There's a new malaria vaccine that's been developed that they're working on, that they're starting to go and do that. But again, the mosquito helps spread this parasite, just like how we saw fleas help spread the bacteria of the bubonic plague. Malaria has been mostly eliminated from the modern United States today. It's one of the great scientific and ecological achievements that the Americans have done in the 20th century. But again, you start going over to places, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, it's still pretty rampant there, which is causing, again, millions of people to die every year from this. It's getting better. It ain't perfect. So who's doing all this work on these New World plantations if the Europeans don't want to do it themselves? Are slaves. So slavery in the New World is going to begin with the Europeans using natives as slaves. So this should make sense, right? Because they're already there. Now the problem is that the natives begin to die off in giant numbers. We'll go due to diseases and their lack of immunity to these European diseases. We'll further explore that point in our final presentation, in our final PowerPoint. So they begin to die off in giant numbers. Again, 90 to 99% of the populations of North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, and South America die off from 1491 to 1591. They can also run away. They can just run away because they know the land, they know where every crook and crick and valley and swamp is, so they can just run away. Right? The natives can revolt because they have giant population centers that are already there who are already used to that, and there's more natives than there are Europeans, particularly early on in these European settlements. The natives also don't have, quote, European farming knowledge. So the native way of farming is vastly different to the European way of farming of taking a giant amount of land and plotting in neat little rows all the same crop. Whereas Africans, who the Europeans have been in contact with, again, since humans have gotten out of Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago, are particularly as the Europeans have spread some of their ideas and stuff into the coastline of sub-Saharan Africa. The Africans kind of have an idea already of this. They're already practicing it in some of these different areas. So the major question is why then to the switch as Africans as slaves? Why not Chinese? Why not Indonesians? Why not Native Australians? Why not just other Europeans themselves? Well, the first major thing we want to emphasize, and this is why we're going to start off with this first, is that this is not due to racism. It's not just that they're randomly picking the Europeans a race to do this. Race is not the issue. Racism becomes invented in the 1700s and 1800s to justify the slavery that's already being used in the 1500s and 1600s. The switch to Africans as slaves also has to deal with New World crops. Crops that originate in the New World, such as peanuts and sweet potatoes, right? So in the New World, which are then being sent back to Africa. And these New World crops are going to fuel a huge population growth of people in Africa. So that's going to start to put economic and ecological and environmental and sociological pressures on the people back in Africa. So one way we can view this African slavery is that the Africans themselves are selling off excess people that are there in Africa because of how many people are starting to be able to survive in Africa due to New World crops doing that. If you go to Africa today, again, particularly sub-Saharan African nations, uh, peanuts and sweet potatoes are going to be a major part of their cultural diets, and that is a relatively recent phenomenon that is a development of this age of exploration. The third reason why we have a switch to Africans as slaves is that the Muslims of Africa and of Arabia have already created an infrastructure amongst various African tribes for slavery that's already existing. So Africans are already enslaving other Africans and are selling them eastward to the Arabian, Indian, Red Sea slave network of Arabia. There's already Africans who are being enslaved that way. And so, with this creation of infrastructure already in place, the Europeans are just showing up and just kind of piggybacking on what's already there. And the African tribes who are enslaving other African tribes are willing to sell people to the highest bidder. So, they don't have any qualms about selling Africans to the Europeans in the West. They're already doing it, selling Africans to the uh, slave networks of the East Africa of the Arabian Sea. So, particularly again, when we focus again on slavery in the New World, this is then going to begin the Atlantic slave trade. And this is the buying and selling of Africans for work in the Americas. From 1500 to 1870, it's estimated that about 9.5 million Africans are shipped to the Americas. If you start to study the amount of people being enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, you can get some crazy statistics that before the year 1800, 4 out of every 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were African slaves being brought in there. It's just that's the amount of numbers of people that are doing that. Most of these slaves are going to end up in Brazil. So this is where, again, Brazil is underlined on your study guide. You're going to probably want to go and work your way back to that, hints and winks and nudges. So most of these slaves end up in Brazil. Then about half end up in Brazil. And when we show you some maps, this should make sense. Why Brazil? It's the closest to Africa. The next, again, about half end up in the Caribbean. And then finally, a tiny trickle is going to end up in all the 13 colonies that will eventually form the United States. So again, roughly half of these enslaved Africans are forcibly brought to Brazil. Another roughly half are brought to the Caribbean, and then a tiny trickle is sent to the eventual 13 English colonies that will make up the future United States of America. If you've seen the beginning of the movie, The Amistad, which is about a 1830 court case, the Amistad beginning of that movie does a pretty good job of dramatically and fictionally showing how the slave networks work, where African tribes are going to other African tribes which they have no ethnic, linguistic, or cultural affinity with, capturing those uh, other Africans either through war or through against profit making, bringing them to European port and fort facilities on the ports, and then trading them for goods to then be shipped across the Atlantic. So again, this should make sense. Where's Brazil? It's right over here, so it's going to make sense. You want to do this the shortest way. So we kind of go and see that it should make sense just geographically. Where are most of these slaves coming from? They're coming from the western coast of Africa, and they're being brought there. And again, the island of Madagascar is pretty easy to ship people back that way, or to be able to ship into uh, European colonies in the east. The African tribes are trading their African continental neighbors for manufactured goods, guns, iron, cannons, and again, we can kind of go and see that they're turning them into bowls and pots like this, depicting the slave trade on there. Hints and winks and nudges. Where do most of these enslaved Africans end up? It should make sense they end up in Brazil. Look at the Brazilian national soccer team, right? The men's and women's team for Brazil, and then go and look at what a native uh, person from Brazil, quote unquote, would have looked like. And you can kind of go and see the effect of the African slavery on the Brazilian populations that we have today. The next major amount showed up in the Caribbean. And then again, we just want to emphasize the tiny trickle of African slaves that's going to end up in the present day United States. So again, to put some numbers on it, and again, rough numbers, we've got about, if we call about 10 million, half of them are going to end up in Brazil, about half of them are going to end up in the Caribbean, and then the numbers of everything else that are going to end up in the different places as well. The African slave trade is a part of a broader trade network of the Atlantic Ocean called the triangular trade. And the triangular trade is a name used to describe the process in which goods and enslaved people were exchanged across the Atlantic Ocean. If you can find some space in your study guide or some space in your notes, I would go and I would draw this in there. It doesn't have to be crazy. You don't have to put the clip art in. You can just write the word Europe. You can write the word Africa. You can write the word the Americas, not just North America, not just the United States, but the Americas. So going from Europe to Africa in this process would be manufactured goods, particularly guns. These manufactured goods would be traded, right, put on boats to go to the Americas, and you're trading manufactured goods and guns in Africa for enslaved Africans. Now, this part of the triangular trade would be called the Middle Passage. We'll get into more on that in the next slide. And then from the Americas back to Europe would be raw materials. These raw materials would be turned into manufactured goods, which would be traded for enslaved Africans to be brought back to the Americas to be able to harvest and create raw materials. And it kind of becomes a cycle that is set up across the Atlantic Ocean here. So again, I would be able to describe hints, winks, and nudges how the triangular trade worked, and particularly what was traded from which continent to where in exchange for what. So that's why drawing this into our notes is probably a good idea. Hint, wink, nudge. So you can kind of see some of the goods and different things there, but we want to emphasize that this triangle that's being made, right, is doesn't have to go and hit all those different places. The SS Sanderson, sailing from Newport, Rhode Island in March of 752, made its own triangle trade here, carrying 8,200 gallons of rum, African short bars, to Africa. That was then exchanged for 56 slaves, 40 ounces of gold dust, 900 pounds of pepper, brought to Barbados to head back to Newport, Rhode Island, carrying 55 hogsheads of molasses. What is that? 3 hogsheads, 27 barrels of sugar, and 400 and what is that? 12 pounds in bills of exchange from a bank in Liverpool. So that is just one small example of the triangle trade that's going on there. To circle back to slavery in the New World, the Middle Passage is the name given by historians that describes the voyage that brought Africans to the New World. This was a hellish experience where they were packed tightly into holds of ships and suffered from disease, humiliation, and beatings on the ship. It's estimated that 20% of the Africans that stepped on off of the continent of Africa onto these boats never stepped back onto dry land, right, because they were thrown overboard and their dead bodies because of all the different stuff that's happening on there. So if you are a slave trader, this is a statistic that you would have to factor into your slave dealings, because if you wanted to sell 100 slaves to be able to make your anticipated profit in the New World, that means you would have to put at least 120 slaves onto your boat in Africa to be able to account for the amount of people that'd be dying along the way. Um, you're spending about a month going across the Atlantic, 3 weeks depending on where you're going, but that's the actual voyage across the Atlantic. Some of these, if we draw our continent of Africa, all right, and we'll try to make it big here, right? Some of these slave ships would be picking up slaves here and then sail to here and then sail here and then sail here and then sail here. So it might be 6 months where you're off the coast of Africa for, say, slaves that get on the boats here before then you make that month or 3 week long voyage across the Atlantic. So that's only compounding the terror and horror and disease and stuff where you're stuck on these ships. Once they arrived in the Americas, slaves would be auctioned off to the highest bidder, and they would work as laborers, field workers, miners, domestic servants. You've had all this information about slavery in the United States and in world history up until this point, so we don't have to get into it. But basically, any job you can think of, African slaves would be used to perform that. There was a wide variety of treatments of these slaves. Some of these slaves were thought of as members of the family and treated very well. But again, that is a very, 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 very small minimum, because the vast majority are going to be used and abused greatly and terribly, horribly. These human beings were thought as property to be used and dispensed with at the whims of the slave owners. But again, there would be a wide disparity in the treatment of slaves, but that means the vast majorities were still being greatly abused and terribly treated. Slaves would find ways to cope with their new lives being forced upon them in the New World. They retained a lot of their music, their culture, their language, and their religion in the places that they were forced to rebuild their lives in. And these are going to have giant effects on the music, culture, language, and religion of the areas where these African slaves settled into, and on the present day countries occupying those areas. Slaves found ways to resist. They didn't just go quietly into that. It's like, oh, I'm a slave now, better get to work. They would break tools and equipment. They would get sick. They would go and not understand instructions. And again, this would be good for the slaves to be able to not have to do as much work, but this is going to then perpetuate negative stereotypes about African slaves and then about African people in these countries that are still trying to be broken to today, just because again they're trying to get out of there. Again, your stereotypical Mr. Lazy in Mr. Kramer's eyes, these lazy freshmen who won't do any work. Well, it's because I mean I was a freshman too. You know how to do any work, so it makes sense. But again, that then creates a stereotype that becomes hard to break to this day. Slaves also would find ways to run away. There's large communities of escaped slaves in Jamaica and Brazil, and it's easy to escape in Brazil because of how big Brazil is and the vast Amazon rainforest that you can set up communities into. The problem that develops today is that some of these communities of escaped slaves that begin to get into the numbers of the thousands and tens of thousands in Brazil in the 16, 17, 1800s, well, as Brazilian populations begin to expand into the 1900s and into the present day, the question becomes who owns that land, because developers are buying this land, but this is land that has been settled by these escaped slaves since the time of the 1700s and 1800s. In Brazil, they've lived there for centuries, but they don't technically own that land because they ran away. It becomes a huge issue that Brazil is dealing with in the present time. Please, 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 please understand that without slave labor, none of these New World colonies would have survived. The New World colonies are built and developed on the back of African slave labor, and these people have just as much claim to the founding and subsequent development of these colonies as the Europeans who, quote, showed up there first do. So please understand that again, without slave labor, not a single one of these New World colonies would have survived or would have survived in the way that the Europeans would have wanted them to make all the money that they did. So this is from a anti-slavery poster in the late 1700s, but this is showing you just how tightly packed these slave ships would be filled with African slaves to be able to maximize as much profits once you landed back in the Americas to sell. Again, these ships you would have, I think they're average about 4 foot of cubic space, so 4 foot high by 4 foot length. So for some of our bigger people in the classes, particularly our taller freshmen, Mr. Cranmer's 5'10", so I wouldn't be able to, if I was in this predicament, stretch my legs out for 3, 4 months or stand up straight. And then again, Mr. Cranmer, very, 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 very seasick. So when this ship starts to move and to roll and to kind of go from there, and this guy who again has never been on a boat before gets seasick and he vomits, and again we think about all the people who vomit when they see other people vomit, and again they're not able to get up to go to the bathroom, and again if you start eating food that you're not used to, what's going to start coming out your other end? So think about the smells and what's going to be sloshing back and forth on the bottom of these ships as they're sailing on these different voyages. So a part of the triangular trade is not just, again, African slaves, but it's other goods as well. And these African slaves are, again, just being thought of as goods to be in there. Now, this top left portion picture is from a art exhibit, but I like it, and I like to show you to again just show you how little space some of these African slaves would be afforded on these ships, and again just the idea of how tightly packed they are in there. Some of these people are being dying in these terrible, horrible conditions, and some of these African slaves would commit suicide and jump over the sides of the boats with their iron shackles on to drown themselves, with the idea that their spirits would then return to their ancestors' homeland back in Africa, because they're not idiots. They know it's going to await them when they go and arrive back in the Americas. So they're landing, being sold off to the highest bidder in slave auctions. And again, or again, we can kind of go and see the bill of sale for an auction to be held of African slaves. And then again, these slaves are treated terribly and horribly, and extraordinarily harsh punishments are needed to be able to put on these harsh slaves because of the frequency of slave revolts that happen in the New World. And so, if the Europeans want to have any hope of keeping the African slaves under their heel and their beck and call, they have to use harsh punishments, because if they didn't, the African slaves would revolt, which they did all the time, and murder the Europeans. So, again, kind of a double-edged sword there to be able to go and think about. So that's how the Europeans have set up their New World colonies and how they've run them, how they're getting people to work on these New World colonies, again, through terrible, horrible punishments like we see here. And then we'll see in our final lecture how this settlement of the New World is going to have an effect on future peoples and plants and animals in this great age, this first great age of globalization.